Imagine noticing a stranger across a crowded room, not because of anything they said, not because of the way they moved, but simply because of the colour of their hair. A deep copper, or perhaps a brighter flame, or something closer to auburn caught between red and brown depending on how the light falls. You notice it because it is unusual, because something in your mind flags it as different, as worth a second glance, and then, almost immediately, something else happens. Without knowing this person at all, without having exchanged a single word, a cascade of associations begins to form, associations that feel almost automatic, almost inherited, as though they arrived in your mind from somewhere far outside your own experience. That is a strange thing when you sit with it. Red hair covers roughly 1 to 2% of the human population worldwide. It is genuinely rare, and yet it carries more cultural weight, more mythology, more symbolic baggage than almost any other physical trait you could name. Poets wrote about it. Painters sought it out. Soldiers feared it as a bad omen. Priests warned against it. Storytellers used it as shorthand for wildness, for passion, for something untamable and ancient. Entire peoples were defined by it from the outside, labelled and catalogued and flattened into a single strand of inherited colour. And all of this happened long before anyone understood what red hair actually was, biologically speaking, or where it came from, or how old it might be in the human story. So tonight, that is the thread we are going to follow together. Slowly, and without rushing anywhere, we are going to trace red hair from the level of the gene up through the archaeological record, through the written histories of ancient civilizations, through the mythologies and the stereotypes and the political stories that grew around it over centuries. We are going to ask what the science actually says, and then we are going to ask what the science cannot say, because that boundary between knowledge and uncertainty turns out to be one of the most interesting places to spend time. Here is the honest starting point. We assume we know what red hair is. We assume it is a straightforwardly Celtic thing, or a Viking thing, or an Irish thing, or a Scottish thing. We assume it is ancient in a way that connects certain modern populations to certain dramatic and specific ancestors. We assume the story is stable and settled. But when you pull on that thread, when you actually go looking at the genetics research and the ancient DNA studies and the historical texts, something more complicated emerges. The story is older than we thought in some ways, and stranger in others. The geography is messier. The cultural meanings shifted dramatically across time and place, in ways that reveal less about red hair itself and more about the people doing the looking. The lenses we will use tonight are several, because no single one gives you the whole picture. Genetics offers us something remarkable now that ancient DNA analysis has become possible. Researchers can look at the remains of people who lived thousands of years ago and ask what variants they carried, what their hair and eye and skin colour might have been. That is genuinely astonishing, and we will explore what those studies have found. But genetics also has limits. It can tell you about a variant in a genome, but it cannot always tell you what that variant looked like on a living body, or what that body's community thought about the colour of their hair. Archaeology fills in some gaps. Material culture, burial practices, geographic patterns of migration and settlement all help sketch the world that ancient people with red hair variants might have moved through. Written history takes us into the realm of perception and meaning, because the Greeks wrote about the Thracians, and the Romans wrote about the Germans and the Gauls, and those descriptions carry within them entire frameworks of thinking about what certain physical traits meant, who they belonged to, what they said about a person's character or temperament or place in the natural order. And then there is myth-making, the layer that perhaps matters most for understanding why a single physical trait can become so culturally loaded, so persistently strange in the imagination of people who do not share it. What we'll find, moving through all of these layers, is that red hair's story is not a straight line from one ancient origin point to one modern population. It is more like a set of overlapping circles, each one representing a different time period, a different cultural context, a different set of assumptions about what bodies mean, and what ancestry tells us. The evidence can carry us a good distance, and then, at a certain depth, it begins to thin out. The certainty loosens. We are left with probabilities and interpretations, with what might have been true rather than what we can confirm was. There is real beauty in that threshold if you are willing to rest inside uncertainty rather than reach past it. Before we go further, I want to pause here and invite you in. Wherever you are listening to this tonight, in whatever corner of the world you have carried your phone or your tablet or your laptop, I would love to know where you are. Drop a comment and tell me your location and what time it is there. Maybe it is late and the house is quiet and you've been trying to find something slow and interesting to carry you towards sleep. Maybe it is early and the light is still grey outside and you are letting words drift through you before the day begins. Maybe you are somewhere in between, stretched out in the afternoon, looking for a pause. Whatever brought you here, I am glad you came. And I want to ask something else. If you have red hair yourself, or if someone in your family does, think for a moment about the stories that have attached themselves to it over the course of your life, the comments people made, the associations that seem to follow, the way the traits seem to carry meaning for others even when it was simply a part of how you moved through the world. Those experiences, however small or large they felt, are part of the larger story we are tracing tonight. Because the history of red hair is not just a history of genes and migrations, it is a history of how human beings have always looked at difference and then filled that difference with meaning, sometimes tender and sometimes cruel, almost always revealing something true about the looking rather than the thing being looked at. That is the mystery underneath the mystery, and it begins, as so many things do, at a level far below what any eye can see. It begins with a single protein and a small variation in a single gene, sitting quietly inside the cells of about 1 in every 100 people alive on Earth right now. Something that ancient, something that rare, something that somehow ended up this loud in the human imagination. That is worth spending a quiet night with. So let us begin at the smallest possible scale. Inside every hair follicle, tucked into the root where growth actually happens, there are specialized cells called melanocytes. Their job is to produce pigment, and they do this through a process that has been running in various forms across hundreds of millions of years of animal evolution. Melanocytes manufacture molecules called melanins, and it is the particular balance of those molecules that determines what color you see when you look at a strand of hair. There are 2 main types of melanin, and understanding the difference between them is essentially understanding the biological foundation of hair color. The first is eumelanin, which is dark. Eumelanin absorbs a broad spectrum of light and comes in 2 main varieties, black and brown, depending on subtle differences in its chemical structure. Hair that is very dark or black tends to have a high proportion of black eumelanin. Hair that is brown contains more of the brown variety, or a mixture. The second type is pheomelanin, and this one is lighter, producing yellows and reds and pinks. Pheomelanin absorbs less light, reflects more of the warm end of the spectrum, and has a different chemical architecture. All human hair contains some mixture of both types, but the ratio is what matters. When eumelanin dominates heavily, you get very dark hair. When the balance shifts toward pheomelanin, you start moving through shades of blonde and auburn and copper and red. Red hair, in its most vivid forms, occurs when pheomelanin production is high and eumelanin production is significantly reduced. The follicle is still active, still producing pigment, but the switch toward the darker molecule has been partly turned off. What you end up with is a strand of hair that contains relatively little eumelanin and a comparatively large amount of pheomelanin, and the result, when light moves through it, is that particular warm glow that draws the eye across a crowded room. The gene most closely associated with this shift is called MC1R, which stands for melanocortin 1 receptor. The protein it encodes sits on the surface of melanocytes and responds to a signaling molecule called alpha-melanocyte stimulating hormone. When that signal arrives and binds to the receptor successfully, it triggers a cascade inside the cell that shifts production toward eumelanin. The receptor, in a sense, is the switch. When it functions well, dark pigment production goes up. When it functions less efficiently, the cell defaults more readily toward pheomelanin. Certain variants in the MC1R gene, changes in its sequence that alter the shape or behavior of the protein, reduce how well the receptor does its job. The signal arrives, but the switch does not fully flip, and so pheomelanin accumulates while eumelanin stays relatively low. There are many such variants, not just one. Researchers have identified dozens of different changes in MC1R that are associated with red hair and fair skin, and they do not all have the same effect. Some variants reduce receptor signaling substantially, others reduce it more modestly. Some combinations of variants have a stronger effect than a single variant alone. This is one reason why red hair exists on a spectrum, from a barely there warmth in otherwise dark hair, to deep auburn, to bright copper, to something almost orange in strong afternoon light. The biology is producing a continuous gradient, not a simple on or off state. And here is where the inheritance becomes more interesting than the familiar phrase suggests. Most people have heard that red hair is a recessive trait, meaning you need 2 copies of the relevant variant, one from each parent, to actually show the colour. That framing is useful as a starting point, but it is also an oversimplification. MC1R does not behave as a strictly dominant or strictly recessive gene in the classical Mendelian sense. Having one variant rather than 2 can still influence pigmentation, sometimes subtly and sometimes more visibly, particularly when it comes to skin tone and freckling. Carrying a single copy might push someone toward auburn rather than brown, or might affect how their skin responds to sunlight without producing obviously red hair. The trait is better understood as existing on a continuum of expression, shaped by how many variants a person carries, which specific variants those are, and what other genes are doing alongside them. Because MC1R is not the only actor in this story. Genome-wide studies, which look across the entire human genome rather than at a single candidate gene, have identified dozens of other locations that contribute to hair colour. Genes involved in the production of melanin precursors, in the transport of melanin within cells, in the overall architecture of the follicle itself. All of these can shift the final outcome. Some people with relatively common MC1R variants end up with vivid red hair because of what is happening elsewhere in their genome. Others carry the same MC1R variants, but end up with hair that reads as dark blonde or light brown. The gene is the most important single contributor, but it operates inside a larger system, and that system is where the full picture lives. This also means that red hair and the other traits commonly associated with it are not as tightly coupled as they might appear. Fair skin and freckling are common among people with red hair, but they are not guaranteed, and the coupling is partial rather than absolute. Pheomelanin plays a role in skin pigmentation as well as hair, and reduced MC1R function affects both, which is why the traits often appear together. But skin tone is influenced by many genes, and so is the tendency to freckle. Some people carry red hair variants but tan reasonably well. Some people have very fair skin and freckle without having red hair. The traits overlap because they often share biological machinery, but they are not a single package that always arrives together. Perhaps the most important thing to hold on to is this: the same visible outcome, hair that looks red, can arise from different genetic roots in different populations. The specific variants that produce red hair in a person of Irish or Scottish ancestry may not be the same variants producing it in someone from a Central Asian background, or in the rare individual with red hair from a sub-Saharan African lineage, or among the Melanesian populations of the Pacific, where a distinct pathway involving a different gene entirely can produce lighter, sometimes reddish hair. The biology converges on a similar visual result through different molecular histories. Evolution, faced with similar pressures or driven by similar chance events, found more than one way to arrive at the same general destination. This is worth pausing over because it quietly dismantles one of the assumptions that surrounds red hair most persistently. The idea that red hair signals a particular ancestry, a particular bloodline, a particular tribe of origin, assumes that the biological mechanism is singular, that there is one gene, one variant, one ancient source population, and that visible red hair is a reliable marker pointing back to that single source. The genetics does not support that cleaner story. The trait is genetically heterogeneous. Its visible expression is influenced by a web of genes rather than a single switch. The same appearance can emerge from different molecular histories in different parts of the world. What looks like a unified phenomenon from the outside is, at the level of the genome, a set of overlapping but distinct stories. That does not make the trait less interesting. It makes it more interesting and considerably more honest. Because what the biology is telling us, even at this earliest level of description, is that physical traits do not have the kind of singular origin story that human beings have historically wanted them to have. We want clean lines. We want one gene, one people, one coherent past. The molecular reality offers us something harder to reduce and, in its own quiet way, much stranger. And that strangeness only deepens as we move forward through time, tracing the gene across tens of thousands of years and asking where it appeared, and when, and what the world it entered might have looked like. So let us go deeper into the specific variants themselves, because once you start looking closely at the individual changes in MC1R that are associated with red hair, a more complicated and more interesting picture begins to form. Researchers working in European populations have identified a handful of variants that come up again and again when they compare people with red hair to people without it. The ones most consistently linked to vivid red hair in Europeans carry names that geneticists use to mark their positions on the protein. Changes at sites often referred to in the literature by their amino acid substitutions, places where a single letter in the genetic code has been quietly altered. 3 of these variants in particular, sometimes grouped informally as the canonical red hair variants, appear with notably higher frequency among people from the British Isles and northwestern Europe. They are not the only MC1R changes associated with red hair, but they are the most studied, the most strongly associated with full phenotypic expression, and the most likely to appear in combination in someone with copper or bright red hair. What makes this interesting is that these variants are not all equivalent. Some reduce receptor signaling more dramatically than others. One combination of 2 strong variants tends to produce more vivid red than a single moderate variant paired with something milder. And because the variants themselves differ in their biochemical effect, 2 people who both visually appear to have red hair may have arrived there through quite different molecular configurations. One person might carry 2 copies of the same strong variant. Another might carry 1 copy of a strong variant alongside a copy of a weaker one, and enough activity in their broader genetic background to push the result into clearly red territory. The outcome looks similar in the mirror, but the underlying path is not identical. This variation between variants matters because it complicates any attempt to think of red hair as a single inherited thing with a single origin. When geneticists ask where these specific changes came from, they are really asking several different questions simultaneously, one for each variant, and the answers do not always point to the same place or the same moment in time. And here is where mutation and drift enter the story in a way that is easy to underestimate. A mutation is simply an error or change in the copying of genetic information. Such changes happen constantly across every generation in every species, and most of them are invisible in their effects, neither harmful nor helpful, just variation. A new mutation in MC1R that reduces receptor function might appear in a single individual in a small group living tens of thousands of years ago. Whether that mutation persists into future generations, whether it spreads to become common or disappears within a few generations, is not entirely a matter of whether it is useful. Chance plays a substantial role. In a small population, random variation in who survives, who reproduces, and how many children each person has can cause certain genetic variants to increase or decrease in frequency simply through luck. This process is called genetic drift, and it is particularly powerful when populations are small and isolated, exactly the conditions that characterized much of human prehistory. This means that a variant associated with red hair did not necessarily become common in a given region because it was strongly selected for. It might have drifted upward by chance in a small founding population and then become characteristic of all descendants of that population, simply because those descendants inherited it from a common source. Or it might have been mildly selected for, conferring some modest advantage in certain environments, and drift and selection together pushed it higher over time. Disentangling these forces is genuinely difficult, and modern genetics has not fully resolved it for the specific variants associated with red hair. Then there is the phenomenon of convergent evolution, which the previous section touched on, and which deserves a little more time here. The same visible outcome, lighter or reddish hair, has appeared in different human populations through different genetic mechanisms. Among some Melanesian populations in the Pacific, a different gene entirely, TYRP1, rather than MC1R, is responsible for lighter hair. This is not the same molecular story wearing different clothes. It is a genuinely independent evolutionary event that arrived at a superficially similar destination. Evolution does this fairly often, particularly when there is a relatively small number of ways to produce a given pigmentation outcome, given how melanin biochemistry works. The pathways are constrained by the underlying chemistry, and so different populations under different pressures can find similar solutions to similar problems without being genetically connected at all. What this means for interpreting red or lighter hair in any given population is that you cannot simply assume shared ancestry because you see a shared appearance. Two distant populations with lighter or reddish hair might have arrived there independently, through separate mutations and separate histories. The trait is not a fingerprint pointing to a single origin, it is more like a convergence point that different paths can reach. The story becomes still more layered when you consider the polygenic background that shapes how MC1R variants actually express. Modern genome-wide association studies, which scan across millions of positions in the genome looking for correlations with visible traits, have found that hair color is influenced by dozens of locations beyond MC1R. Genes involved in the transport of melanin granules within cells, genes that regulate the timing and rate of pigment production, genes affecting the overall architecture of the follicle, all of these contribute. Some act as amplifiers, pushing the effect of an MC1R variant further toward vivid red. Others dampen it, keeping the expression subtle even when the MC1R variants are present. This polygenic background is part of why predicting hair color from genetics alone remains imperfect even now, and why red hair continues to surprise geneticists in the ways it appears and in the populations where it turns up. It is worth being honest about the limits of modern genomics here, because they are real and they matter for how we should interpret everything that follows. The populations most thoroughly studied in hair color genetics are European, and within Europe there is a strong bias toward northwestern populations, the British Isles in particular. This means that what we know about the genetics of red hair reflects a relatively narrow slice of human diversity. Sampling from other parts of the world remains sparse. Ancestry inference, the practice of using genetic data to determine where someone or their ancestors came from, carries genuine uncertainty, and the error margins increase as you move further from the populations that are well represented in reference databases. Predicting phenotype from genotype, trying to look at someone's genome and say what they looked like, is possible in broad strokes but is consistently less reliable than popular accounts suggest. Ancient DNA studies in particular, which attempt to infer the appearance of people who lived thousands of years ago, are subject to significant uncertainty because the samples are degraded, incomplete, and filtered through methods that carry their own assumptions. All of this is context for the central puzzle that the genetics sets up without fully solving. If these red hair variants arose by mutation, if they are influenced by chance drift, if they can appear through convergent pathways in unrelated populations, and if their expression depends on a complex polygenic background, then why did they reach relatively notable frequencies in certain parts of the world and not others? Why do they cluster in northwestern Europe with a particular intensity? What combination of history, environment, chance, and selection produce that pattern? The biology tells us the machinery. It describes the switch and the signal and the pigment, but it does not by itself explain the geography. For that, we have to follow the gene backward through time, into a world that was colder and darker and considerably stranger than the one we now inhabit, and ask what pressures might have been shaping human bodies across tens of thousands of years, in places that are now familiar but were then almost unrecognizable. If we want to follow that gene backward, the most obvious question is also the one that turns out to be the hardest to answer cleanly. When did hair that we would recognize as red actually appear? At first glance, it seems like something we should be able to pin down. We can date fossils, we can sequence DNA from bones and teeth, we can model population histories with computers. Surely we can point to a time, or at least a rough window, when some ancient person first carried the combination of variants that would have given them copper or auburn hair. The problem is that hair itself almost never survives. Keratin, the protein that makes up hair, does not fossilize in the same dependable way that bone and tooth enamel do. It can persist in very specific conditions, extreme dryness, freezing, bogs. But those are rare, and even when the hair remains, its original color is not always obvious. Pigments degrade. The chemistry that produced the color in life can be altered by burial, by microbes, by the passage of time itself. A lock of ancient hair that looks dark now may not have looked dark thousands of years ago. We cannot simply line up ancient braids and curls and read their colors like a timeline. This is why so much of the story has to be told indirectly, through DNA extracted from skeletal remains, and the traces that DNA still carries of the molecular pathways that produce pigment. Ancient DNA work does not usually give us entire genomes in pristine form. It gives us fragments, damaged by time, peppered with chemical alterations that have to be carefully filtered out. From those fragments, researchers try to reconstruct stretches of the genome that include genes like MC1R and others involved in pigmentation. What they can see, when it works, are specific variants at specific positions, a change that in living people today is strongly associated with reduced MC1R function, and with a higher chance of red hair, can sometimes be identified in the DNA of someone who lived thousands of years ago. In a few cases, enough of the genome survives that scientists can look not just at MC1R, but at a wider panel of pigmentation-related genes, and estimate overall tendencies toward lighter or darker skin, lighter or darker hair, lighter or darker eyes. But even there, the language shifts from certainty to probability. Ancient DNA allows researchers to say that an individual likely had a particular pigmentation profile based on how similar their genetic variants are to those in modern people, where genotype and phenotype correlations have been measured. It is an inference, not a photograph. When we say a prehistoric woman had a high probability of red hair, what we really mean is that if someone living today had the exact same combination of alleles, they would very often have red hair. The further back in time we go, and the more the surrounding genetic background differs from any modern population, the more cautious that kind of statement has to become. With those caveats in mind, what does the current evidence suggest about timing? One way scientists approach the question does not begin with specific bones at all. It starts instead with patterns of genetic diversity in modern populations. When a new mutation arises, it appears at first on a single genetic background, in one person, in one lineage. As it spreads over generations, recombination chops up that background. By looking at how much of the original surrounding DNA still tends to travel with the variant, and by modelling how quickly recombination and random mixing would erode that association, researchers can estimate how long ago the variant likely appeared. Applied to some of the canonical MC1R variants associated with red hair in Europeans, these variant age estimates usually place their origins somewhere in the late Pleistocene to early Holocene, a wide bracket that runs roughly from tens of thousands of years ago into the period after the last ice age, when glaciers were retreating and new habitats were opening up. The ranges are broad because the models have to account for past population sizes, migration, and the possibility of selection, all of which affect how quickly a new variant spreads or stalls. Another approach looks straight at ancient genomes and asks, when do we first see these specific variants in people we can date archaeologically? Here the record is still patchy. Ancient DNA work is much denser in some regions than others, and preservation conditions skew the sample towards certain climates. But there are hints. Some hunter-gatherer individuals from late Ice Age and early post-glacial Europe carry MC1R changes that in modern people are associated with lighter hair, including variants that lean toward reddish shades. Later, Neolithic and Bronze Age individuals, especially in northern and western Europe, also show a sprinkling of alleles that in today's populations correlate with red or auburn hair. Taken together, these lines of evidence suggest that the molecular building blocks for red hair, reduced function MC1R variants, supportive backgrounds at other pigmentation genes, were present in Eurasia by at least the later stages of the last ice age, and likely arose independently more than once. That does not mean that vivid copper hair was suddenly common across the landscape. A variant can exist at very low frequency for a long time, tucked away in small groups, while the visible trait it enables appears only rarely. It is also important to be clear about what we even mean when we talk about red hair appearing. Modern categories, the labels we casually apply, strawberry blonde, auburn, ginger, copper, are overlaying a spectrum that is continuous rather than discrete. In genetic studies, researchers sometimes draw a line for analytical convenience. People who self-report or are scored as red versus those who are not red. But in reality, the shift from brown to chestnut to auburn to orange-red is gradual, and how it shows up in a given individual depends on lighting, age, and cultural expectations as much as on their alleles. If we went back 20,000 years and stood in a late Pleistocene camp in Western Eurasia, some of the people we would see might have hair that, by our modern eye, we would call brown with a red cast, or dark blonde with warm copper tones. Others, more rarely, might have had hair approaching what we now think of as clearly red. To those people, however, hair would have been categorized in the terms of their own languages, their own comparisons, which we do not know. The emergence of the phenotype is one thing. The emergence of red hair as a named, socially meaningful category is another later development, This is why scientists tend to talk about pigmentation spectra and probability distributions rather than fixed types when they model the past. A given MC1R variant might modestly increase the odds of having hair shifted toward the red end of the spectrum. Carrying two strong variants on a supportive background of other genes pushes that probability higher. In some ancient populations, those combinations were very rare. In others, especially in parts of northern and western Europe in the Holocene, they became more frequent. Still, the timing is not uniform even within Europe. Age estimates for different red-associated MC1R variants do not all cluster neatly in a single epoch. Some appear older, compatible with an origin in Pleistocene forager populations. Others look younger, perhaps arising or rising in frequency during the complex period of population turnovers that accompanied the spread of farming, and later the movements of steppe-related groups into Europe. There are competing models that emphasize different episodes, glacial refugia in southwestern Europe, for example, versus later demographic pulses from the northeast, as key theatres for MC1R diversification. None of those models is settled. Each relies on assumptions about past population sizes, migration routes, and selection pressures that are still being debated. As new ancient genomes are sequenced from previously undersampled regions, estimates shift. A variant thought to be confined to one area turns up unexpectedly in another. A presumed young allele turns out to be older but rare, its history shaped by drift in small scattered groups. So instead of a single origin moment, the picture that emerges is one of a staggered layered emergence. Mutations reducing MC1R function appeared, likely multiple times, in different individuals living in Ice Age and post-Ice Age Eurasia. Some of those changes vanished along with the small groups that carried them. Others persisted at low levels, their visible effects muted by the broader genetic and environmental background. Under certain conditions, in certain lineages, they combined with other factors to make hair shift steadily toward the copper and auburn end of the spectrum, and in some regions, over thousands of years, those combinations became more common. We can sketch that outline, but the exact dates, the precise paths, remain blurry. That uncertainty is not a failure of the science so much as an honest reflection of how much time has passed and how fragile the evidence is. The story of when red hair appeared, like the colour itself, is not a sharp, clear line. It is a gradient that deepens as we move into the colder, dimmer worlds of the north, a gradient that will come into sharper focus only as more fragments of ancient genomes are coaxed back into legibility and fitted piece by piece into the broader map of human history. As the ice sheets thinned and pulled back, they did not leave behind an empty stage. They left behind new rules. For human bodies, one of the simplest and most powerful of those rules was light. Not firelight or starlight, but the ordinary thin sunlight that drifts down even on a cloudy day. That light is not just something we see by. It drives chemistry deep under the skin. And one particular chemical pathway, turning precursor molecules into vitamin D, is especially sensitive to how much of that light actually penetrates. This is where one of the most widely discussed ideas about pale skin, light eyes, and perhaps red hair comes in, the vitamin D hypothesis. Our ancestors in equatorial Africa evolved under intense ultraviolet radiation. Darker skin, rich in eumelanin, helped protect DNA from UV damage, helped shield folate and other fragile molecules. When some populations began moving northward into higher latitudes, they carried that high melanin system into places where UV, especially UVB, was dramatically reduced for much of the year. Long winters, low sun angles, thick cloud cover, snow that reflected light but did not increase the most useful wavelengths. All of this meant that the body's own vitamin D production could have been strained. Vitamin D is not a minor supplement for prehistoric life. It plays roles in bone health, immune function, muscle strength. Deficits, especially in childhood, can lead to rickets and other problems that directly affect survival and fertility. So one idea is that, in these northern environments, individuals whose skin let more UV through, who had less melanin in the upper layers, could synthesize vitamin D more efficiently. Over many generations, in populations that relied heavily on plant foods or on animals that did not provide much vitamin D, natural selection might have slowly favoured alleles that shifted skin pigmentation lighter. Within that framework, red hair sometimes gets treated as just another step on the same gradient, Turn down the melanin knob, the body gets paler overall, hair shifts from black to brown to blonde to red as a side effect. But the actual biology is messier, and red hair is a bit of an oddity. When MC1R function is reduced, the pigment machinery does not simply produce less colour, it changes the balance of what kind of melanin is made. Eumelanin, the brown-black pigment that is especially good at soaking up UV and scattering it safely, is dialed down. Pheomelanin, the yellow-red pigment that gives copper hair its glow, is dialed up. Pheomelanin does not shield in the same way. In some contexts under UV, it can even contribute to the formation of reactive oxygen species, the little sparks of chemical damage that the body has to constantly repair. So a person with red hair and very fair skin is not just lightly pigmented. They are pigmented in a particular direction that can make them more susceptible to sunburn and certain kinds of skin cancer, especially in modern environments with long lifespans and high UV exposure from travel, recreation, or ozone changes. That makes red hair a special case in any simple adaptation story. If low UV in the north favours light pigmentation to help vitamin D production, why would it favour this kind of light pigmentation, which seems to come bundled with extra sensitivity? One answer might be that, in some very northern environments, the cost side of that trade-off was smaller. Think of groups living at latitudes where, for substantial parts of the year, the sun is weak, the air is cold, and most of the body is covered in fur, hide, or woven cloth. The risk of intense chronic UV damage in childhood might have been relatively low. At the same time, diets based on marine mammals or fatty fish could provide large amounts of vitamin D, reducing the pressure for extreme depigmentation. In such a mosaic, alleles that push pigmentation toward the red spectrum might drift upward in frequency, without needing to be directly advantageous in a narrow vitamin D sense. Another answer is that selection might not have been working on sun and skin at all, but on something more elusive, how people saw each other. This is where sexual selection enters the conversation. Red hair is rare in most populations today. Within a group where dark hair is the norm, a sudden appearance of copper or auburn can stand out dramatically. Some evolutionary psychologists and anthropologists have proposed that this very rarity could, under certain cultural conditions, draw attention in a way that affects mate choice. If, for whatever local reason, a particular shade becomes associated with attractiveness, fertility, good fortune, or simply with being different, individuals carrying the underlying alleles might, on average, have more partners or more surviving children. The idea can be framed as a frequency-dependent effect. What is uncommon becomes more eye-catching, and thus potentially more favoured, until it becomes common enough that novelty fades and the advantage diminishes. In this kind of model, red hair, or any striking pigment variant, might rise and fall in frequency over time, not because it protects against rickets or sunburn, but because it glows against the background of people's expectations. Evidence for this is indirect. We do not have access to the beauty standards of Mesolithic fisher hunters or early Bronze Age villagers in their own words. What we do have, in later historical periods, are repeated references to red hair as conspicuous, as something remarked upon, sometimes desired, sometimes feared. That tells us at least that unusual hair colour tends to become socially loaded. Whether that social loading ever translated into consistent reproductive advantages in prehistory remains speculative, but it is a possibility that cannot be ruled out. Yet even sexual selection might not be the whole story. Genes almost never do just one thing. MC1R is a pigment receptor, but it sits in networks that touch immune responses, inflammatory pathways, pain sensitivity, and perhaps even aspects of metabolism. This is where the idea of pleiotropy comes in. One gene, many effects. It is conceivable that some of the MC1R variants we now associate with red hair spread, or persisted, not because of the hair colour at all, but because of other, less visible traits they subtly influenced. Maybe a particular variant tweaked the immune system in a way that provided a small edge against certain pathogens in cold, damp climates. Maybe it affected how the body handled oxidative stress, or altered pain thresholds or thermoregulation. In that scenario, the red hair would be a hitchhiker, a visible marker of deeper, harder-to-detect adaptations, or even of trade-offs that made sense in one environment but not in another. There is also the quieter force of chance, amplified when populations are small. As the glaciers retreated, people were not spread evenly like paint across the map. They were clustered in refuges, valleys, coastlines, little bands moving along rivers, islands and newly opened plains. In such small groups, genetic drift can be powerful. A neutral or even slightly disadvantageous allele can rise to moderate frequency simply because its carriers happened, over a few generations, to leave more descendants. This is the realm of founder effects. When a small subset of a population, by migrating or becoming isolated, carries with it only a sliver of the original genetic diversity. Imagine a handful of families, leaving a larger group and following reindeer or fish, runs into a new northern corridor. By chance, a couple of them carry an MC1R variant that tilts hair toward auburn. In the homeland, that variant might have been rare, lost amid thousands of other lineages. In this little pioneer cluster, it suddenly makes up a much larger slice of the gene pool. A few generations later, half the people in that valley have some degree of red in their hair. No adaptive story is required at the outset. The landscape of genes has simply been reshaped by who happened to go where. Over time, of course, selection and drift intertwine. A founder effect might raise the frequency of a pigmentation allele in a particular northern group. Then, in that new context, with different diets, different pathogens, different social norms, selection might begin to favour, or disfavour, that allele for reasons entirely unconnected to the original accident that brought it there. When scientists try to weigh these possibilities, vitamin D-driven adaptation, sexual selection on visible rarity, pleiotropic byproducts, founder effects and drift, they do so by looking for patterns that are subtly different in each case. If a pigment allele shows strong signals of having been rapidly swept to high frequency in one latitude band but not others, that can hint at environmental selection. If it is common in one isolated group but almost absent in nearby populations with similar ecology, that might point to founder effects. If MC1R variants correlate in modern biomedical data with traits beyond pigmentation, differences in pain perception for instance, that nudges pleiotropy onto the table. But these are hints, not verdicts. For red hair specifically, the balance of evidence so far suggests a mixture. There are signals that some lighter pigmentation alleles, including certain MC1R variants, have been under selection in northern Eurasia, consistent with the broad vitamin D story, though not exclusively explained by it. There is clear evidence that small, historically isolated populations can end up with very high frequencies of particular red-associated alleles, consistent with founder effects. And there are enduring questions about how much social preference in different times and places may have nudged these traits up or down. What remains is a sense of layered causation rather than a single cause. Northern light levels set the stage by changing the cost and benefit landscape for pigmentation. Human movements after the ice shifted which variants were even in play in a given region. Social perception may have periodically spotlighted certain appearances, and the genes involved, like MC1R, were likely doing more in the body than just colouring hair. As we move forward in time, out of the immediate shadow of the glaciers and into a Europe that is slowly filling with forests, fields and villages, those layers continue to interact. The copper glint that might have been barely noticeable in a small Ice Age camp becomes, in some places, a familiar thread in the tapestry of faces. In others, it remains rare, remarked upon, woven into myth. The next part of the story unfolds in that changing landscape, as post-glacial Europe settles into its new shapes, and the genes we have been following begin to meet farmers, herders, and the first stirrings of the societies whose written traces will eventually teach us to name red hair at all. Europe after the glaciers is not a single place on a map. It is a set of narrow corridors, river basins, coasts and uplands, slowly reconnecting after thousands of years of ice and isolation. When the great ice sheets pulled back, they did not retreat evenly. They left behind pockets of survivable land that had already been occupied for a long time, refugia in the south and along some coasts, where hunter-gatherer groups had waited out the cold. As the climate warmed, people from these refuges began to move. Some followed the Atlantic edge, coasting northward from Iberia into what would later be France, then Britain and Ireland, skirting new shorelines as sea levels rose and drowned older paths. Others moved up through the heart of the continent, along the Rhine, the Danube and countless smaller rivers, tracking herds, fish runs, and the slow spread of temperate forest. Still others came from the east, from the broad plains that had stretched between Europe and Asia in the coldest times, now breaking up into steppe, woodland and marsh. Genetically, this meant that the first post-glacial Europeans of the north and west were not an undifferentiated population. They were a braid of related but distinct hunter-gatherer lineages, each carrying its own small bundle of mutations, including whatever MC1R variants and other pigment alleles had drifted or been selected in their Ice Age shelters. In small moving bands like these, chance has a loud voice. Picture one group that left a southern refuge and moved along the Atlantic, where, by accident, 2 or 3 individuals carried MC1R variants that nudge pigmentation toward auburn. Another group, following a different river northward, might simply not have those variants at all. Over dozens of generations, both groups grow, split, and resettle, but the initial imbalance remains baked into their descendants. This is how bottlenecks work. Each little founding episode samples only a portion of the wider gene pool, and what it happens to include can become disproportionately common. Once those founding populations are in place, isolation begins to amplify the differences. A valley cut off by dense forest, a peninsula whose easiest access is by boat, an island severed by rising seas, each becomes a kind of genetic echo chamber. Alleles that are rare or absent a few hundred kilometers away can quietly rise to notable frequency here, simply because there are fewer new genes coming in to dilute them. That set the stage for the next great movement, the arrival of early farmers from the southeast. Around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, groups practicing agriculture and animal husbandry began moving out of Anatolia and the Near East into southeastern Europe. They brought wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and their own genetic profiles, including pigmentation variants shaped in different climates. Over centuries, then millennia, these early farmers spread west and north, sometimes moving into valleys and fertile plains that hunter-gatherers had sparsely used, sometimes living side by side with local foragers, sometimes replacing them, often mixing with them. When two such populations meet, gene frequencies do not simply blend into a smooth average. Local dynamics matter. If farmers were more numerous, their alleles might rapidly dominate, diluting whatever rare MC1R variants the foragers had carried. If, instead, the first successful farming communities in a region formed by small groups of farmers marrying into larger forager bands, the opposite could happen. Local hunter-gatherer variants, including those tied to specific hair shades, could persist or even rise in frequency inside a population that, culturally, now identified as a farmer. In this era, Europe becomes a patchwork in a new sense. Some areas, like parts of the Mediterranean coast, were heavily influenced by incoming farmers very early, with genetic profiles that leaned toward those southern sources. Interior and northern regions often retained more ancestry from older forager groups, whose pigment genetics had been shaped under different conditions. Two valleys that looked similar on a map could end up quite different in who lived there, what they ate, and what range of skin, hair and eye colours was common. Then, still later, another wave moved in from the east, populations associated with the Pontic-Caspian steppe, often linked to the spread of Indo-European languages. These pastoralists, arriving around 5,000 years ago, brought horses, new burial customs, new social structures, and yet another genetic layer. In many parts of Central and Northern Europe, their ancestry became a substantial component of the population, mingling with the earlier farmer-forager mixture. Each wave did not erase the last so much as stack upon it. In some regions, steppe-associated groups became dominant and their genetic variants, including certain light pigmentation alleles, spread quickly. In others, their presence was milder, diluted by larger, longer-established farming populations. The result was a mosaic, a patch of land where red hair-associated variants might reach higher frequencies, bordered by another patch where they remained scarce, even though both areas shared similar latitude and climate. This is why, even within Europe, neighbouring regions can show sharp differences. A peninsula like Scotland, a western island like Ireland, a coastal pocket in Scandinavia, an upland in Central Europe. Each has its own history of who arrived when, who married whom, which small founding groups got established and stayed relatively insulated, and which corridors channeled constant new gene flow. Red hair, being tied to a cluster of relatively rare variants, is especially sensitive to these historical accidents. In one region, a combination of founder effects, partial isolation, and perhaps mild selection on pigmentation could allow those variants to drift upward. In another, repeated migrations and larger population sizes might keep them diluted, never allowing them to become common enough to define local appearance. By the time we reach the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age, Europe is crisscrossed by movement: traders, brides, war bands, wandering specialists. Genetic boundaries blur, but they do not vanish. Pockets of distinctive looks remain, sometimes reinforced by geography, sometimes by social boundaries. Who is considered us and who is them? It is in this landscape that appearance starts to acquire more elaborate meanings. A certain shade of hair or eyes, more common in one neighbouring group than another, can become a shorthand. It can be noticed, remarked upon, associated with origins, virtues, vices. When people look across a river or a mountain ridge and see faces that look subtly different, they do not see allele frequencies, they see those people. The stage is now set for something new, not just the silent work of genes and glaciers, but the first written stories, myths, and stereotypes about bodies. As the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean begin to look northward, they will encounter this patchwork of hues and shapes and give them names, meanings, and myths that will echo down to us whenever we picture a redhead. When Greek and Roman writers first tried to describe the human variety around them, they reached not for genetic explanations, but for the vocabulary they already had. Words for earth and fire, for metals and animals, for wine, wheat, and sun. Their language for hair colour was not a neat chart of fixed swatches. It was a cluster of impressions. In Greek, one of the most common words you see is xanthos. It is often translated as blonde, but that is only a convenient modern choice. Xanthos could mean yellow, like dry straw, golden, like ripe grain, tawny, like a lion's mane, even something approaching light brown with a warm cast. When Homer calls Menelaus xanthos, translators argue, is this a flaxen-haired king, or just someone lighter than average in a world where most hair was dark? Greek also had terms that lean more clearly toward what we might call red. Pyrrhus, from the root for fire and flame, could mean fiery, reddish, rust-coloured. The same root appears in words for flaming torches, for the colour of certain animals, for burning. Yet even here, the boundary is soft. Pyrrhus might be applied to hair with a coppery sheen, to a reddish beard, or to a brown that glows warm in the sun. Latin shows a similar blur. Flavus is often rendered as blonde or golden, associated with light yellowish hair. Fulvus pushes toward tawny, yellow-brown, perhaps like a lion. Rutulus suggests a reddish gold, a shining copper, something burnished rather than flat. Rufus is closer to red, but not the cartoon red of a crayon, more like rust, dried blood, or chestnut bark. A Roman describing a Rufus man might be seeing anything from auburn to what we would, today, confidently call carrot red. These terms were flexible and they overlapped. Two different authors might reach for two different words to describe the same head of hair, depending on the light they imagined, the region they knew, the metaphors they favoured. None of them were working with our modern mental palette of black, brown, blonde, red as sharp boxes. Into this hazy colour language the idea of the barbarian enters. For Greek city-states looking out across the Aegean, barbarian originally meant those whose language sounded strange, whose speech was heard as bar bar bar. Over time the word collected other layers, foreign customs, different dress, different gods, and eventually a stack of moral judgments about softness, fierceness, decadence, or savagery. Physical appearance became one of the easiest ways to mark this difference. Northern peoples, Thracians, Scythians, later Celts and Germans, were often described as taller, paler, and possessing hair that was xanthous, pyrrhus, flavus, rutulus. To Mediterranean eyes accustomed to mostly dark hair and eyes, any shift toward lightness could feel striking. It became a shorthand. A Greek writer might sketch a scene of red-haired, loud-voiced Thracians as a kind of quick label. You, the reader, are meant to supply the rest. Their wild dances, their foreign weapons, their unfamiliar songs. A Roman author might evoke long-haired Rufus Germans to summon up an image of restless tribes at the edge of the known world, brave or brutish, depending on the point he wants to make. In these descriptions, observation and judgment run together. Herodotus, sometimes called the father of history and sometimes of ethnography, mixes careful notes with hearsay and moral commentary. He remarks on Scythian customs, on Egyptian hairstyles, on the peculiarities of distant peoples, but he does not separate what he has seen from what others have told him, or from the stories that already circulate in his culture. Later Roman writers do the same. Tacitus, describing the Germans, notes their blue eyes, reddish hair, and huge frames, and he subtly contrasts their supposed simplicity and bravery with Roman decadence. The appearance of these northerners is not neutral data. It carries an argument about virtue and decline. Here, red hair is not just pigment, it is a symbol. Sometimes it signals wildness and unrestrained passion, sometimes noble savagery, sometimes raw martial energy not yet softened by civilization. A head of bright or tawny hair becomes an emblem of the edge of the world, where the climate is colder, the sun lower, the day stranger. Yet we have to be cautious when we look back through these texts and try to attach them to specific modern types. For one thing, the palette in the ancient Mediterranean was already more diverse than stereotypes suggest. In Greece and Italy, there were always people on the lighter end and the darker end, people with hair that could be called xanthos next to others whose hair was deep black. In such a setting, someone slightly lighter than the local norm might be described with a term we would reserve for a much more extreme shade. For another, many people did not leave their hair colour entirely to nature. Greek and Roman sources mention dyes, bleaches, and other treatments. Some men and women lightened their hair with lime-based preparations or plant extracts, then oiled and curled it. Others darkened grey hairs with lead-based mixtures. Wigs made of imported hair circulated, and hairpieces could be styled and coloured in ways that did not match the wearer's genetics at all. Sunlight itself was a powerful agent. In an age when people worked, marched, and travelled outdoors, dark hair could bleach at the tips, taking on a lighter, sometimes reddish tone while remaining darker at the roots. Sea spray, wind, and mineral-rich water could all shift how hair looked, especially when it was kept long. A Greek observer describing the golden or reddish locks of a northern warrior might be seeing that combination of base colour and environmental lightening, then capturing it with a single vivid word. Add to this the way stories shift over time. Famous figures accumulate details that make them more memorable, more symbolic. Alexander the Great, for example, is described in some later sources as having a kind of lion-like, slightly reddish, or golden hair. How much of this reflects reality, and how much is the story bending him toward heroic imagery borrowed from mythic lion men and sun kings, is hard to untangle. Similar things happen with collective labels. Later Roman and medieval authors might retroactively imagine whole tribes as flame-haired, because red hair had crystallized as a convenient marker of northern otherness. Actual skeletal remains, when we can extract DNA or analyze preserved hair, suggest a range of shades among those populations, not a uniform crowd of redheads. So when an ancient text says that a people is red-haired, we should hear a cluster of possibilities. It might refer to genuinely high frequencies of MC1R variants that produce copper or ginger hair by modern standards. It might instead describe a predominance of lighter brown or blondish hair that, against a Mediterranean baseline, felt strikingly pale or warm. It might even be a literary habit, a way of flagging, these are the northerners, without a precise colour in mind. Early ethnography in the Mediterranean did not draw hard lines between seeing and judging. Climate theories, ideas that the sun, air and soil shaped bodies and character together, encouraged writers to read morality off of appearance. A darker, sun-baked southerner might be imagined as passionate and subtle, a paler, redder northerner as impulsive, brave, but lacking in refinement. These were not scientific claims, they were narrative tools. In that world, hair colour became part of a story people told about themselves and their neighbours. It was one more sign to be read, one more hint about where someone came from, how they might behave, what role they might play in the grand drama of empire and frontier. And crucially, the red hair in those stories is not a single, crisp, modern category. It stretches from honey gold through copper and chestnut to the deeper russet tones. It lives in adjectives that shimmer between metal and fire, lion and wheat, flame and rust. It reminds us that when we try to map ancient words onto modern genetic boxes, we are always translating across not just time, but imagination. As the Mediterranean world kept looking north and west, these shimmering impressions hardened into more familiar stereotypes. The red-haired barbarian would be picked up, repeated, sharpened, and eventually woven into the self-images of the very peoples it once described from a distance. When Greek and Roman writers first began to attach names to those northerners, they did not yet mean what we mean: Celt, Gaul, German, Scythian. These were elastic words. Sometimes they pointed to language families, sometimes to regions, sometimes simply to whoever happened to be fighting Rome that decade beyond a certain river. A single tribe might be called Gallic in one text and Germanic in another, depending on where the author thought the frontier lay. Yet through these shifting labels, the image of the fair, ruddy or red-haired northerner grew stronger. Caesar, writing about the Gauls, stresses their bravery and volatility. Other Roman authors echo tales of tall, pale warriors with light eyes and striking hair. Some emphasize wild manes of golden locks, others pick out the fiery, rudderless tones. They were fascinated by the way some Celtic elites reportedly washed and lime-stiffened their hair, combing it upward so it stood away from the head, catching the sun like a burning crest. Later, when writers turned to the peoples they came to call Germany, the pattern continues. Tacitus claims the Germans are a pure, unmixed race, native to their cold lands with reddish hair and fierce blue eyes. He lets their appearance carry his argument. These are people shaped by a harsh climate into raw courage and rough virtue, in contrast to the softening luxury of Rome. Reading these lines now, it is tempting to map them onto modern ethnic pictures, to imagine Celts as a freckled, red-haired folk west of the Rhine, Germans as tall, blonde or russet tribes east of it, each already a sort of prototype for present-day nations. But that is our story, not theirs. The ancient labels cut across what we would think of as genetic neighbourhoods. Archaeology and ancient DNA show that Iron Age Europe was a mosaic of overlapping ancestries, with gradual gradients rather than razor-sharp borders. People moved, married, traded, were adopted, enslaved, and freed. The skull in a German burial ground might carry more in common genetically with some Celtic neighbours than with another tribe given the same literary name. Hair colour followed that messy reality. MC1R variants associated with red hair appear in ancient DNA, scattered across regions we would now call Celtic-speaking, Germanic-speaking, and beyond. They are not the property of a single tribe. What changes from valley to valley is not a hard on and off switch, but frequency, a bit more common here, a bit less there, layered over by climate, diet, and chance. Ancient writers did not have this map. They had impressions. A Gallic mercenary cohort with a few spectacular flame-haired leaders might fix reddish Celts in the Roman imagination for generations. A Germanic warband whose hair bleached in northern sun and was described as gold or rust could become a stock image for the Germans as a whole. By the early Middle Ages, as Latin-speaking scholars looked back through that classical lens, these portraits began to harden. Monks copying Tacitus or late Roman chronicles in Ireland, Britain and the Frankish kingdoms encountered themselves and their neighbours in those old descriptions. But the political landscape had changed completely. The peoples now living in Gaul, in Britain, in the regions once called Germania, were heirs to multiple streams of ancestry. Late Roman provincials, incoming Germanic-speaking groups, earlier Iron Age populations, and in some zones, residual threads reaching back even before the Celts Rome knew. Local languages had shifted, tribal names vanished or fused, yet the old Latin phrases about blue eyes and fiery hair remained, like ghosts in the margins. In this setting, regional myths began to grow. In the Celtic-speaking islands and fringes of the Atlantic, medieval tales sometimes highlight heroes with distinctive colouring, red or golden hair, ruddy faces, bright eyes. Not all of them are redheads, some are dark, some fair. But over time, and especially in later retellings, the red-haired warrior, or the fiery-haired woman of power, becomes a recognisable motif. At the same time, in the German-speaking heartlands, chroniclers and poets could glance back at Tacitus and see, in his reddish-haired, blue-eyed Germans, a flattering ancestry. As the idea of Christian kingdoms and peoples took shape, some elite lineages enjoyed connecting themselves, however loosely, to those stern northern forebears, strong, free, uncorrupted by Roman decadence. None of this yet resembled modern nationalism, but the seeds were there, the sense that certain physical traits mentioned by the ancients could stand as tokens of a timeless people. Hundreds of years later, when nationalism did rise in a sharper form, those seeds were cultivated with care. In some cases, writers in Ireland, Scotland or Wales leaned into the association between Celts and red hair, turning it into a badge of distinctiveness from their neighbours. In other cases, English or continental observers used the same association in a mocking or hostile way, presenting red hair as a sign of impulsiveness, savagery, or backwardness inherited from ancient barbarians. In German-speaking lands, the reddish or blonde northern type, already celebrated in some Romantic-era art and literature, could be selectively emphasized. Passages from Tacitus about tall, fair Germans were quoted again and again, while the diversity he also hints at and the messy history of migrations and mixtures were quietly sidelined. Red and gold hair, light eyes, and height could be spun into symbols of a supposed original Germanic essence, even where the actual populations were varied in looks. What makes this more complicated and more fragile is that archaeology and genetics do not line up neatly with these later stories. Excavated cemeteries in what is now France show continuities from late Roman through early medieval times, suggesting many local families stayed put as languages and rulers changed. Ancient DNA from Britain reveals shifts in ancestry with Anglo-Saxon and later Viking movements, yes, but also deep persistence of older lineages. Across northern Europe, red hair-linked variants appear and reappear in different contexts, without obeying medieval or modern political borders. You can stand in a village in western Norway, one in western Scotland, and one on the North Sea coast of Germany, and encounter red-haired people in each. The exact frequencies differ, but the trait does not respect the banners on the map. This is the gap we have to keep in view, the space between cultural identity and genetic trait frequency. A community can decide over centuries that our people are red-haired warriors or fair-haired farmers, even if only a portion of them actually have those traits. A myth can take a minority feature and make it emblematic, just as easily as it can ignore a common one that does not fit the story. The presence of red hair in a population does not prove it is Celtic, Germanic, Viking, or anything else. It only tells you that, among the many versions of the MC1R gene wandering through human history, some particular ones have settled there in noticeable numbers. When we read ancient and medieval texts, we are listening to stories told within particular political and emotional worlds. Hair colour appears as shorthand, as praise, as insult, as a way to draw lines between us and them. When we look at bones, genomes, and settlement patterns, we are reading a different archive, one in which people move, mix, and adapt in quieter, slower ways than the texts suggest. Between those two archives, stories and skeletons, the figure of the red-haired northerner emerges not as a single, timeless type, but as a shifting silhouette, sometimes Celtic, sometimes Germanic, sometimes simply barbarian, sometimes proudly claimed, sometimes anxiously denied. As we follow that silhouette into the era of seafaring raiders and traders from the far north, the questions grow sharper. For if red hair has become a symbol of northern edge and ancient ferocity, what happens when we meet the people who, in popular imagination, are its ultimate owners, the Vikings? If you picture a Viking right now, chances are a certain face appears behind your closed eyes. Maybe it is a tall figure in furs and mail, an axe across the shoulder, sea wind in plaited hair. And that hair, more often than not in modern images, is light, pale blonde, ash blonde, maybe a bit of sun-browned gold in the beard. Sometimes, if the artist wants a touch of menace or wildness, it is a fierce copper red. But when we turn from modern pictures to the words of the people themselves, the image begins to blur. The Old Norse sagas and poems, written down in Iceland and elsewhere in the centuries after the Viking Age, but drawing on older oral traditions, do notice hair. They are not indifferent to appearance. They tell us when someone is handsome, when a woman is fair, when a warrior stands out in a crowd, yet they do so in ways that don't quite match our rigid categories. A man in these texts might be described as fair and fine-featured, his hair bright or light, but these phrases do not always specify a precise shade the way we would. Fair can blend complexion, hair, and overall impression. The Icelandic word ljós can mean light and colour, but it can also carry a sense of shining, of brightness, rather than a flat paint chip hue. When the sagas do give more pointed details, a variety of looks appears. Some heroes are called Hafagri, fair-haired or beautiful-haired, like Harald Fairhair, the semi-legendary Norwegian king. The tradition makes much of his long, luxuriant hair as a sign of youth and charisma. Others have nicknames that mark striking traits: Raudskeg, Redbeard, Kolbita, Coalbiter, who might be imagined dark and brooding, Svati, the black one, Haviti, the white or fair one. Female figures, especially noble women, are often praised for long, well-kept hair. It may be golden, it may simply be called beautiful, thick or shining. The lines between light brown, dark blonde, and outright gold are porous in this language. Red hair appears here and there, but it does not dominate the stage. So if we step into a Viking Age hall, we do not necessarily walk into a room full of identical flaxen warriors. We enter a world where hair colour is one thread among many in a tapestry of status, demeanour, and reputation. Beauty ideals in these societies seem to lean toward what stands out as healthy, well-nourished, and well-groomed in a harsh climate. Clean, combed hair, no obvious filth or matting, strength in the body, brightness in the face. In a world where winter is long and food can be scarce, that alone marks someone as fortunate and desirable. This is one reason cleanliness and grooming feature more in the sources than we might expect. Early medieval observers from elsewhere in Europe sometimes complain, with a mix of irritation and unwilling admiration, that the Norsemen wash more often than their neighbours, comb their hair, and tend to appearance in ways that make them dangerously attractive to local women. The stereotype of the unwashed barbarian does not quite fit here. Bleaching and hair lightening practices complicate the picture further. Several medieval texts, including ones written by outsiders looking north, hint that Scandinavian men sometimes treated their hair with strong soaps or lye solutions. These alkaline washes could clean, degrease, and over time lighten the hair, especially if it was already on the lighter side. Combined with sun and salt from life at sea, a head of mousy or medium brown hair could take on a distinctly blondish look. Beards, too, might be shaped or lightened. Archaeological finds of combs, grooming tools, and soap-like substances in Viking contexts support the idea that appearance was actively managed, not passively received. In such a culture, blondness in the eyes of an observer may sometimes have been partly a style, encouraged, emphasized, or even chemically coaxed out, rather than purely a matter of inherited pigment. This does not mean that true natural blondes were rare in Scandinavia. Ancient DNA from the broader northern European region suggests a mix of hair colours, with light shades relatively common. Nor does it exclude red hair. Variants in genes like MC1R associated with red hair today appear in ancient Scandinavian remains, though, as elsewhere, often at modest frequencies. The probability that people with naturally reddish or auburn hair lived, sailed, and ruled in Viking Age Scandinavia is high, but the trait seems to have been one element in a diverse palette, not a signature badge of Vikingness. Later sagas sometimes single out fiery hair as a noticeable trait, a red-bearded chieftain, a russet-haired warrior. Yet these mentions do not elevate red hair above all others as a defining ethnic marker. They work more like nicknames based on any standout feature, in the same family as the fat, the strong, the short, or the deep-minded. So how did we get from this textured, varied world to the streamlined Viking of modern imagination, whose hair is almost always one of two extremes, gleaming gold or blazing red? Part of the answer lies in a familiar pattern, later generations looking back through selective lenses. 19th and early 20th century European artists, writers, and nationalists took the Viking Age as a romantic origin story. In countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, emerging national cultures reached for these seafarers as symbols of independence and strength. In Britain and elsewhere, the Viking became a sort of wild cousin from the past, both feared and secretly admired. At the same time, ideas about Nordic or Germanic racial types were being popularized, and these often idealized light hair and eyes as marks of a particular northern stock. When artists painted or sculpted Vikings under these influences, they leaned into blondness as a visual shorthand. This is northern, this is vigorous, this is our imagined ancestor. Red hair, already associated in some traditions with fierceness or Celtic otherness, could be used when a more volatile, barbaric energy was wanted. Film, television, and later games absorbed this palette and simplified it further. Casting calls sought tall, fair actors. Wigs and dyes made sure everyone on the longship looked like they shared a single hair colour gene. A few flaming red characters might be sprinkled in for variety or thematic punch. Dark-haired Vikings appeared too, but the default had been set. In the process, the real variation on the ground, light browns, dishwater blondes, dark blonde mixes, auburn hints, and straightforward brown and black hair faded from view. The Vikings became, in popular culture, not a population but a type, and hair colour one of the clearest markers of that type. This is where the story of red hair and of blonde hair slips from biology into pure symbol, a trait that in reality floats across northern Europe at different frequencies, subject to chance, migration, and marriage, becomes pinned to a single imagined people. To say someone looks Viking is, in modern speech, often to say they fit that visual script. Tall, light-haired, perhaps ruddy or freckled, the genetic reality, Viking age communities drawing in local wives, taking and freeing captives, settling abroad, and blending with neighbours, vanishes behind the myth. Red hair in this framework becomes a sort of spice. A Viking with red hair in a modern series is likely to be hot-tempered, bold, unpredictable, carrying echoes of older stereotypes about fiery Celts or dangerous outsiders. Yet the same pigment change in a different story might signal vulnerability, difference, or even marginalization. The biology has not changed. The meanings layered onto it have. What the Vikings show us, then, is not the origin of any particular hair colour, but the power of storytelling to rearrange the palette. With a handful of sagas, some Latin chronicles, a great deal of later art, and the needs of modern entertainment, one corner of the human spectrum of hair became a badge for courage, conquest, and a certain northern mystique. The actual heads in those longships, with all their varied shades and homemade bleaches, were more ordinary and more complicated than that. As we sail west with them, toward the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, we meet lands where red hair would take on new lives, as both a familiar local feature and a symbol reshaped again, this time by empire, memory, and the restless tides of the Atlantic. If we follow those ships to shore and then begin to walk inland, something interesting happens in the statistics. Today, if you map where red hair is most common, a kind of glowing patch appears over the northwestern edge of Europe. Parts of Ireland, Scotland, and some neighbouring regions stand out as places where the chance of meeting a natural redhead is higher than almost anywhere else on Earth. Not everyone there is red-haired, of course. In most of these regions, even in so-called hotspots, brown hair still wins by sheer numbers. But if in many European populations only a small, single-digit percentage of people have noticeably red hair, some surveys in Ireland and Scotland reach toward, or just above, 10%. When you broaden things out to include people who carry red hair variants silently, without showing the trait themselves, the proportions grow larger still. Geneticists sometimes talk about an Atlantic or Northwest European cluster when they look at DNA patterns across the map. It is not a sharp border, more like a gentle gradient along the ocean's edge. Ireland, Scotland, parts of Wales and England, bits of Brittany and beyond, all sharing certain common threads in their ancestry, shaped by the Atlantic seaways as much as by the land. Within that cluster, red hair emerges not as an isolated Irish or Scottish marker, but as one noticeable peak in a broader landscape of northern variation. One reason those peaks can stay high in certain corners is simple geography. For much of history, many coastal communities in these regions were relatively small, and at times relatively isolated. A ring of sea or bog, a ridge of hills, a difficult estuary, these could slow the flow of new people, new genes. Not stop it entirely, but damp it down. In a village where most marriages happen among people living within a day's walk, chance has more room to work. If, by accident, that community happens to start with a few families who carry MC1R variants that encourage red hair, those variants can drift upward in frequency over generations. Children marry neighbours who are, in a statistical sense, already a little bit like them. The dice are rolled again and again from a pot that already has more red hair sides than average. In very small populations, one successful lineage can also nudge the needle. If a prolific clan happens, just by luck, to carry more red hair alleles than their neighbours, their many descendants will quietly raise the local odds, even if no one ever thinks of them as the red-haired family. This is not destiny. It is not a magical property of islands. It is probability playing on a slightly smaller stage, where random swings can leave long shadows. At the same time, these coasts were never completely cut off. They sat on some of the busiest sea roads of the early medieval and later worlds. Long before Viking sails appeared, there were older Atlantic networks. People from Ireland and Britain were in touch with the continent through trade, missions, and marriage. Bronze Age and Iron Age movements had already mixed farmers, herders, and seafarers along these shores. The red hair variants themselves are older than any recorded kingdom here. They did not spring out of the soil of County Kerry or the Highlands overnight. When Norse raiders and settlers arrived, they were not adding something utterly alien to a blank slate. They were inserting themselves into a population that already carried a range of Northern European genetic ingredients, including those that can give rise to red hair and pale skin. Later, when Norsemen married local women, or when Gaelic families and Norse families blurred into one another, the same underlying variants swirled in new combinations. On top of that came Anglo-Norman nobles, English and lowland settlers, Huguenot refugees, soldiers, labourers, and many others. Each wave left some traces and washed others thinner. The genetic picture we see today in Ireland and Scotland is the layered result of all these comings and goings, plus the quiet, stubborn influence of distance and terrain. Because these layers are complex, popular stories often try to make them simple. You can hear it in pub conversations, in tourist brochures, in family lore. Red hair comes from the Vikings, or from the ancient Celts, or from one particular wandering tribe. Sometimes it is tied to a saint's legend, or to a warrior queen, or even to a half-remembered tale about Spanish sailors washed ashore after a storm. There are always grains of truth. Norse settlement did change the genetic makeup of coastal Scotland and parts of Ireland. Gaelic kingdoms did have their own distinct histories and internal marriages. Later migrations from England and elsewhere did alter regional patterns again. But none of these can be singled out on their own as the one true source of red hair. The gene variants that lead to red hair in these islands are, as far as current research can tell, broadly shared across Northern Europe. Some particular versions may be a little more common in one region than another, but they do not map neatly onto a single people, a single invasion, or a single heroic age. They behave more like shared pigments in a painter's box, used in different mixtures at different times. Surnames and clan identities can complicate matters further. In places where family names or clan affiliations became strong markers of belonging, they often gathered stories around them. A clan might remember a legendary red-haired founder, and over time that detail becomes a badge. We are the red-haired ones. A few striking portraits or tales of flame-haired chiefs can overshadow the quiet reality that most bearers of the name have brown or dark blonde hair. In Ireland and Scotland, where surnames can be tied to particular valleys, islands or stretches of coast, it is tempting to see a red-haired child as proof of some deep, ancient lineage. Viking blood, pure Gael blood, a link to a famous rebel or saint. The mind loves neat lines. It loves to turn a probability into a story. Yet when geneticists actually look at DNA in these populations, the patterns they find are statistical, not genealogical in that romantic sense. One surname might show a slightly higher chance of carrying certain variants than another, but there is always overlap. The same red hair allele can live quietly in many different families, many different clans, untroubled by the tales they tell about themselves. Local lore, meanwhile, tends to magnify whatever is most memorable. If a small island happens to have a run of red-haired schoolchildren in one generation, the story of the red-headed island can take hold and linger long after hair colours shift back toward the broader average. Memory is not a census, it is a spotlight. The safest way to think about all this, especially if you are listening and wondering about your own ancestry, is in terms of chances rather than destinies. Having red hair, or an Irish or Scottish surname, or grandparents from a windswept Atlantic town, raises the probability that certain gene variants sit somewhere in your genome. It nudges the odds, but it does not write a clear singular origin story. You might carry a variant passed down from someone who farmed in the Boyne Valley 3,000 years ago. You might carry another that once rode in from the east with a medieval trader. You might share still others with people in Norway, the Low Countries, or northern France. Red hair here, in this Atlantic cluster, is not a secret code pointing back to one tribe. It is a visible ripple in a long tangled current of migrations, marriages, and chance. The map shows us where that ripple is strongest, but not the names of all the hands that set it in motion. As we follow that current beyond the rocky headlands of Ireland and Scotland, it does not stop at the edge of Europe. It stretches onward, carried by ships and stories to new continents, where the same old gene will meet entirely new surroundings and take on new meanings yet again. When we look beyond those familiar coasts, the story does not suddenly turn off like a light at the edge of a map. It fades, it changes, it picks up different colours, but it does not disappear. Red hair, or things that look like red hair, turn up in places where older schoolbooks once implied they had no business being. Sometimes this is as simple as a family in North Africa, where a few children, generation after generation, are born with coppery hair that deepens toward brown as they grow. Sometimes it is a shepherd in the mountains of the Middle East, remembered in his village as the reddish one. Sometimes it's a mummified body in a desert, its hair stained by time into a shade that looks, in a museum case, surprisingly like something from a Scottish postcard. Each of these cases tempts the storytelling part of the mind. It wants a single thread to pull. It wants to say, here, this is proof that such and such ancient tribe must have come here, bringing red hair with them like a secret seal. The genetics and the history are more patient and more tangled. In Central Asia, there are the famous mummies from the Tarim Basin, preserved in the dry sands of what is now Western China. Some of these individuals have hair that appears light, sometimes blondish, sometimes with a reddish or auburn cast. They are often described as European-looking in older accounts, with tall stature, long noses, and woven textiles that remind some viewers of Western traditions. From there, it is a short leap, in imagination, to long migrations. Perhaps these people were ancient Celts gone astray, or relatives of steppe nomads from farther west, or survivors of some lost northern tribe. What we can say with more confidence is narrower than the legends. Ancient DNA studies suggest that the Tarim people were part of a complex mixture of ancestries, including very old lineages native to that region, and some inputs connected in broad terms to the wider Eurasian steppe. They were not simply transplanted Western Europeans, nor a stray outpost of one modern nation's mythic ancestors. The hair itself presents further caution. The colour we see today is the result not only of original pigment, but of thousands of years of burial. Chemical changes, the breakdown of melanin, and the interaction between hair and surrounding soil can all lighten or shift shades. Dark hair can fade toward reddish or blonde. Pale hair can take on new tones. What looks fiery under the bright lights of a display case may have been, in life, a much quieter brown. Some researchers have looked directly at the genes preserved in these remains. A few alleles associated with lighter hair and eyes in Western Eurasia do appear, though the picture is still based on relatively small samples and evolving methods. Whether those particular Tarim individuals would have had distinctly red hair, as we use the term today, is less certain. They may instead have occupied that broad middle ground of light brown, chestnut or sandy hair that under certain lights and with the help of time leans visually toward red. So the Tarim mummies tell us something real, that variants linked to lighter hair were not confined to the Atlantic fringe, and that ancient Eurasia was populated by people with a surprising range of appearances. But they do not neatly confirm the idea of red-haired Celts marching all the way to China. They fit better into a picture of overlapping populations and shared genetic tools, recombined again and again across the breadth of the continent. If we turn southwest instead, toward the shores of the Mediterranean and beyond them to North Africa, we find a different kind of evidence: words. Greek and Roman writers occasionally mention reddish or ruddy hair among the peoples they encountered to the south and east. Medieval Arabic and Hebrew texts sometimes describe a merchant, a scholar, or a ruler by noting that his hair was inclined to red, or between yellow and red. In modern North Africa, you can still meet families in the Rif or the Ore Mountains with fairer complexions and hair that, in childhood, glows copper before deepening. Here, trade and migration are visible in the historical record as well as in the genome. Phoenician sailors moved back and forth between the Levant and the Maghreb. Carthaginian, Roman, Vandal and Byzantine regimes brought in soldiers and settlers from many corners of the Mediterranean. Later, Arab conquests, Berber dynasties, Ottoman garrisons and European colonists all added their own threads. Among these many strands, variants in genes like MC1R could ride quietly, just as they did around the North Sea. In some places they remained rare. In small communities they might have become slightly more common through the same processes of chance and kinship that shaped the Atlantic cluster. A red-haired child born in a Moroccan village in the 15th century may have owed her hair to a long-ago Roman soldier, or to a local line in which those alleles had simply persisted, undramatic but unextinguished, for many generations. The Middle East shows similar patterns. Populations in the Levant, Anatolia and parts of the Caucasus occasionally produce individuals with distinctly reddish hair, especially when they are children. Here too, the region's role as a crossroads between Africa, Europe and Inner Asia means that gene variants have had many chances to mix, scatter and resurface. Beyond the Old World heartlands, there are cases that look, at first glance, even more surprising. On some Pacific islands, in parts of Melanesia for example, there are communities where people have dark brown or deep black skin paired with naturally light or reddish hair. For a long time, outsiders assumed this must be the result of admixture with Europeans. Modern genetic studies have shown something more interesting. In several of these groups, the lighter hair is associated with local variants in genes such as TYRP1, not the same MC1R variants common in Europe. This is a clear example of what biologists call convergent evolution. Different populations facing their own environments and histories can arrive at similar outward traits through different underlying genetic roots. A rusty halo of curls in a child from the Solomon Islands and a coppery plait in a child from Wales may look, to a casual observer, like the same phenomenon. Underneath, different molecular stories are at work. Even within Europe and its global descendants, not all reddish hair arises from the classic redhead background. Some indigenous groups in the Americas and elsewhere occasionally show auburn or copper tones, especially in childhood. These can be influenced by combinations of pigmentation genes that are not identical to the familiar European variants, as well as by diet, health, and sunlight exposure. And then there is the trick played by time and lighting. Many babies are born with hair that will not match their adult colour. A child in the Middle East or North Africa might begin life with a mop of light, reddish fuzz that darkens to brown or black during adolescence. Old photographs and family memories often freeze that early phase and turn it into a story. Your grandfather was a redhead. The genes involved might be subtly affecting hair at several stages. They might also be interacting with hormones and other growth processes in ways we do not fully map yet. Sunlight can bleach hair, especially when it is already on the lighter side. Fishermen, farmers, or children who spend long hours outdoors in bright climates often develop streaks and tips that look bronze or reddish compared to the untouched roots. In historical accounts, a traveller arriving from a cloudier country might note these sun-struck heads as red, even if, by genetic standards, they would sit closer to light brown. Diet, too, leaves its mark. High consumption of certain foods rich in carotenoids, compounds that add yellow and orange pigments, can subtly shift the tone of hair and skin. Over years, these changes might reinforce the impression that a population is redder than its genome alone would suggest. When all of these layers are taken together, ancient mixtures, local mutations, climate, age, and the way human memory compresses complex shades into simple labels, it becomes harder to sustain a neat single migration myth for red hair. Instead of one arrow on a map pointing from some imagined homeland outward, we see a web. Northern variants drifting along sea routes to new coasts, old Central Asian lineages carrying their own light hair alleles, island populations evolving similar hues by different genetic paths, children across continents whose hair briefly flashes copper before settling into the darker palette of their peers. Red hair beyond Europe, then, is not just an echo of one wandering tribe. It is a reminder that evolution reuses and recombines its tools, that human movement has rarely respected our later borders, and that the colours we think we see are always filtered through light, memory and time. As we move back toward the European Middle Ages, those filters will become even stronger. The same traits that once were simply noticed, pale skin, ruddy hair, freckled faces, will begin to gather moral meanings, omens and stereotypes, as stories about what red hair means grow louder than the quiet, indifferent story written in the genes themselves. In the early Middle Ages, people in Europe did not meet genetics. They met bodies. They met faces in the half-light of a church, under the painted gaze of saints and demons. They met strangers at markets and fairgrounds, on pilgrimage roads and battlefields, and when they tried to make sense of what they saw, they reached first for stories, not for DNA. Hair colour, like every visible feature, could become part of a moral code. In Christian Europe, where scripture and sermons saturated daily life, colours were rarely just colours. White and gold leaned toward purity and glory. Black, in many contexts, leaned towards sin, secrecy or sorrow. Red, the colour of blood and fire, sat in the charged space between. Red was the colour of martyrdom, of the Holy Spirit imagined as tongues of flame, of Christ's blood on the cross. It could signal sanctity pushed to its limits, devotion written in pain. But red was also the colour of anger, lust, and spilled blood in battle. In paintings and stained glass, devils, tempters, and the damned often carried red garments, red faces, or red accents to mark their dangerous intensity. Somewhere inside that palette, real red hair found itself recruited. Early medieval writers sometimes treated unusual hair colours, especially very fair or very red, as simply noteworthy. Chronicles might describe a king or warrior as yellow-haired or fiery without attaching any clear moral judgment. In heroic poetry, a bright head of hair could be a sign of distinction, a way to make a character stand out in a crowded lineage of names. Over time, however, the moral colouring of bodies thickened, and red hair was increasingly pulled into symbolic work. Artists and authors needed shortcuts. In a world where not everyone could read, images had to do a great deal of talking. A single stroke of pigment could signal, this person is dangerous, this one is passionate, this one is not like us. Red hair became one of those strokes. One of the strongest medieval associations in Western Christian art tied red or reddish hair to betrayal. From the High Middle Ages onward, Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus, was frequently shown with reddish or yellow-red hair and beard. Not always, and not everywhere, but often enough that it began to feel like a pattern. This choice was not an attempt to report what anyone thought Judas actually looked like. It was a visual shorthand, a way for worshippers, glancing up from the pews, to recognise the traitor at once. Red hair here did not mean this is what red-haired people are like, so much as this is a convenient symbol for treachery, because the colour already suggests heat, excess, and moral danger. Similar logic coloured depictions of other suspect figures. Mary Magdalene, in Western imagination, shifted over centuries from follower to supposed repentant prostitute, and was increasingly pictured with long, flowing reddish or golden hair. The hair in her case could signal sensuality and earthly passion, now redirected toward Christ. In some plays and poems, women with vivid hair, whether red or simply exaggerated golden, stood in for temptation itself. Physical traits became props in a theatre of morality. This did not mean that ordinary red-haired people in medieval villages were automatically treated as villains. Surviving records do not suggest that they were systematically persecuted for hair colour alone. For many it was probably just an oddity, a family quirk, something remarked upon and then absorbed into the local tapestry. But when anxiety rose, about outsiders, about heresy, about the boundaries of the community, traits that already carried symbolic charge could quickly be pulled into suspicion. As witchcraft accusations flared in parts of Europe between the late medieval period and the 17th century, some regions developed folk ideas that red hair might mark someone as dangerous, fickle, or more likely to traffic with the supernatural. Manuals written by witch hunters occasionally listed hair colour among a cluster of suspicious signs, although it was rarely decisive on its own. Local sayings, in some areas, warned young men to beware of red-haired women, folding older threads of lust and betrayal into new fears of sorcery. It is easy, from a distance, to exaggerate this. Modern retelling sometimes suggests that redheads as a group were hunted or targeted as witches across Europe. The evidence is more uneven than that. Many accused witches were older women with no particular mention of unusual hair. Climate, property disputes, village quarrels and religious tension mattered far more than pigment. Still, hair colour could be one more way to signal that someone stood a little outside the imagined norm, especially in small communities where difference drew comment. In a time when difference was risky, that could whisper trouble. Religious polemics added another layer. In Christian anti-Jewish imagery, some artists gave Jewish figures reddish or lurid hair, exaggerating features already considered other. This was not because most Jewish people had red hair. Historical descriptions and genetic data alike suggest that, as in surrounding populations, it appeared but was not dominant. Instead, the colour served the same function it did for Judas, to mark them, visually, as spiritually suspect. Later, in the Reformation era, Protestant and Catholic propagandists hurled insults back and forth with a similar toolbox of symbols. Enemies might be drawn with wild, ruddy hair to suggest uncontrolled passion or moral disorder, or with pale hair drained of life to suggest spiritual deadness. Hair was a canvas for anxiety, and yet, as always, real life muddied any neat story. Some rulers and nobles with red or reddish hair were admired, even idealized. Medieval and early modern chronicles describe certain Scottish, English and Scandinavian kings as fair or red-haired, in ways that seem clearly complementary, linking the colour to vigour, courage, or noble lineage. In some northern contexts, a ruddy beard could be a mark of fierce masculinity, not a sign of treachery. Red-haired saints and holy figures also appear. Not all religious art followed the Judas code. In some regional traditions, Christ himself, or local saints, were painted with light brown or auburn hair, their colouring shaped as much by local aesthetics and available models as by theology. Whatever symbolic scripts existed were never airtight. The same colour that damned Judas could, in another frame, halo a beloved monarch or a folk hero. The same shade that fueled gossip about a neighbour's temper might, in another village, simply mark a child as unique, even cherished. These mixed signals show how stereotypes can be both powerful and porous. They are built out of repeated associations, red with fire, fire with passion, passion with sin or sanctity, and then laid over real human diversity. Once in place, they tend to linger, even when the original meanings that gave them force begin to fade. By the early modern period, as Europe inched toward new sciences of the body and new forms of classification, many of the medieval symbolic layers on red hair had already become half-remembered habits. A playwright could give a scheming character red hair and trust that audiences would pick up hints of volatility and danger, even if they would have struggled to explain why red hair meant that. A joke about redheads being hot-tempered or inconstant could land because it was familiar, not because anyone could trace it back to Judas in stained glass. These lingering echoes matter because they often outlast the worlds that made them. The allegorical paintings become museum pieces, the sermons fall silent, the witch trials end. But the shorthand associations remain, drifting into new eras and attaching themselves to new ideologies. As Europe moves into the age of empires, race science, and modern nationalism, those old colour codes will be picked up again, reworked into claims about blood, ancestry, and who truly belongs. Claims that will reach far beyond the quiet, indifferent chemistry of a gene like MC1R. When 18th century thinkers began sorting the world into races, they did not start from a blank page. They carried with them centuries of stories about bodies and colours, saints and sinners, heroes and traitors. Those stories slipped quietly into the new language of measurement and classification. What had once been allegory and rumour was dressed up in the vocabulary of types, stocks, and scientific observation. Instead of Judas and Mary Magdalene, there were now Celtic, Teutonic, and Mediterranean races. Instead of sermons, there were treatises, travelogues, and anthropological reports. But the habit remained the same: look at the surface of a body, assign it to a category, and then let that category do the heavy lifting of explanation. Red hair, light eyes, and pale skin were swept up into this new project. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European empires expanded and new nations took shape, scholars and amateurs alike tried to map human variety onto neat labelled boxes. They argued about how many races there were, how to define them, and which ones sat at the top of imagined hierarchies. They measured skulls, catalogued eye colours, and took careful note of hair, its shade, its texture, how often a particular colour seemed to appear in one region or another. From these observations they spun stories that felt old and new at once. A freckled farmer in rural Scotland might be drafted as evidence of an ancient Celtic race. A fair-haired Swedish soldier might become a data point for a Nordic or Germanic type. Red hair, because it was unusual and visually striking, became useful both as a badge of distinctiveness and as a thread to tie disparate places together. 19th century writers argued over where exactly to file it. Some placed vivid hair, whether fair or red, at the heart of an exalted Nordic race, tall, warlike, supposedly destined to rule. Others preferred to attach red hair to a Celtic stereotype, emotional, artistic, fiery, a little unstable. The same shade that one theorist treated as a mark of cold northern superiority, another treated as proof of passionate southern fringe. These labels, Celtic, Nordic, Slavic, Alpine, and many more, did not simply describe, they prescribed. They were folded into nationalist myths as countries like Germany, Italy, and later smaller states tried to define themselves. Political movements picked the features they liked, then projected them backward. A new nation might claim descent from a noble blonde and red-haired warrior race, even if its own population included a wide array of skin tones, hair colours, and mixed ancestries. In this way, older moral palettes, read as fiery, dangerous, intense, fair as pure and elevated, were quietly repackaged. What medieval art had done on church walls, race theorists now did with tables and diagrams. A line drawing of a Nordic man with pale hair and keen features could stand in for discipline, rationality, and moral fitness. A Mediterranean figure with darker hair might be associated with sensuality and cunning. A speculative Celtic type with reddish hair could be charming, brave, but erratic. These were not neutral descriptions, they were wishful thinking, sharpened by politics. To give their theories weight, writers leaned heavily on selective evidence. They favoured examples that fit the story they wanted to tell, and quietly set aside the awkward ones. If a visitor to a northern village found several red-haired children, this might be praised as confirmation that the local stock was ancient and pure. If in the same village most adults had dark hair, that could be brushed away as contamination from some later, less favoured migration. The method was elastic enough to fit almost any outcome. Anthropologists measured skulls and noses, collected hair samples and coded eye colours, then grouped people into types that blurred all the messy variety on the ground. A family with one red-haired child, two dark-haired siblings, and parents of intermediate shades did not sit comfortably in a rigid classification scheme. So the scheme tended to ignore such families, or use them as evidence of decay and mixture. The more complex the data became, the more forcefully some thinkers insisted on simple categories. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these ideas flowed into the currents of eugenics. If humanity could be divided into higher and lower types, the argument went, then it might be possible, perhaps even necessary, to breed for the desirable ones and discourage, or prevent, the reproduction of the rest. Physical traits, including hair colour, were no longer just signs of temperament. They began to be cast as indicators of fitness, worth, and destiny. In some nationalist pamphlets and pseudo-scientific works, fair and red hair were praised as hallmarks of a superior northern people, threatened by dilution through intermarriage. In others, red hair could still be treated as an eccentric, unstable touch, combining older stereotypes about volatility with new anxieties about degeneration. The language of sin and virtue gave way to the language of better stock and defective traits. But the moral structure remained remarkably similar. Red hair might be framed as a treasure to be preserved in the right bloodline or a troubling sign when it appeared in the wrong one. Either way, it was being forced to carry meanings it could not possibly bear. Modern genetics looks back on all of this with a very different set of tools. When scientists today examine variation in genes like MC1R across Europe and beyond, they do not see a handful of pure, separate races delicately balanced against each other. They see gradients, overlaps, and centuries upon centuries of movement and mixture. The regions with higher frequencies of red hair variants do not form sharp, isolated islands. They form loose clusters, fading into one another. The same genetic changes associated with red hair in Ireland or Scotland can be found, at lower frequencies, in places as distant as Russia, the Near East, or Central Asia. They travel along old trade routes and migration paths, not along the clean borders of nationalist maps. Geneticists speak of admixture, the blending of lineages, as the ordinary state of human populations, not a rare or fallen condition. Every person carries in their DNA traces of many ancestors, some from nearby, some from surprisingly far away. A trait like red hair is one visible ripple on the surface of that deep pool, influenced by a handful of variants, their interactions, and the accidents of inheritance. It is not a seal of racial purity or a stable marker of an ancient tribe. Genetics can, with careful work, illuminate where certain gene variants are more common, how populations have moved and mixed, and how traits have spread or diminished over time. It can sketch probability that someone with red hair in a given region is more likely to have ancestors from certain parts of the world. But there are equally clear limits to what it can say. It cannot tell you what your identity should be, what language you belong to, which culture you are allowed to claim, or what moral qualities you possess. It cannot read courage, creativity, trustworthiness, or national character off a strand of DNA. For it certainly cannot take a single visible trait, like hair colour, and build from it a story about pure bloodlines or chosen peoples. Those stories, when they appear, are not coming from genes. They are coming from human desires, fears, and the powerful temptation to turn chance variation into destiny. In that sense, the myth of purity is a very old tale wearing a modern mask. It grows out of the same instinct that once painted traitors with red hair, in stained glass, and imagined saints with gilded curls, the urge to sort, to symbolize, to make the messy variety of human appearance stand for neat moral categories. The difference now is that we have, in principle, the tools to see through it. We can trace the red hair gene not to a single chosen people, but to multiple origins and long histories of mixing. We can see that the pure types of 19th century diagrams were abstractions, smoothed averages drawn over a churning sea of individual variation, and we can begin, carefully, to let visible traits be what they are, interesting, sometimes informative, often beautiful quirks of biology, rather than tickets into imagined hierarchies. Still, even with genetic data in hand, the old habits of thought do not vanish overnight. Stereotypes linger in jokes, in casting choices, in casual remarks about temper and trustworthiness. National myths continue to flirt with images of ancestral warriors and distinctive looks. Red hair remains, in many places, a small but charged signal, a reminder of how easily a few molecules of pigment can be asked to carry the weight of entire stories about belonging. In the quieter light of science, those stories look thinner. The chemistry of MC1R has no interest in nations or races. It only concerns itself with how a cell responds to signals, how much eumelanin or pheomelanin to make, how much to share with a growing hair shaft. The rest, the moral weight, the pride, the prejudice, is something humans supply. When we step away from myths of purity and destiny, what remains is a quieter but still important story. How a trait like red hair can nudge the odds in certain directions without deciding anyone's fate. One of those nudges has to do with sunlight. The same pigment chemistry that lightens hair often goes along with lighter skin and a different pattern of tanning. Variants in genes like MC1R change the balance between darker eumelanin and the reddish pheomelanin. When the balance tilts toward red and away from brown or black, the skin usually has less built-in protection against ultraviolet radiation. Across many studies, people with classic red hair and very fair skin are, on average, more prone to sunburn. They may burn faster and more deeply, even in fairly modest sun. In some cases, and especially in places with strong frequent UV exposure, this increased sensitivity shows up as a higher risk of certain skin cancers over a lifetime. But even here, the story is not simple. Red hair does not operate in a vacuum. Latitude matters, clothing matters, shade, time of day, medical care, and habits that build up over decades all matter. Two people with similar hair colour but different lifestyles can face very different risks. And not everyone with an MC1R variant looks or burns the same way. Some red-haired people tan, some dark-haired people burn easily. Many individuals carry a red hair variant but never express it visibly, yet their skin behaviour in the sun may still shift slightly. What genetics offers, in this case, is not a curse or a guarantee, but a reminder to pay attention. For someone in Dublin or Glasgow in the 18th century, living mostly indoors or in cloudy northern light, the trade-off might have been favourable: easier vitamin D production, a bit more risk if one happened to be outdoors on a rare blazing day. For someone with the same genetic background who later migrated to Australia or the American South, the balance could tilt toward danger without shade, hats, and sunscreen. The pattern is evolutionary in scale, but very personal in its consequences. Another thread in this modern story runs through a very different set of observations: pain, anesthesia, and how bodies respond to medical care. Beginning in the late 20th and early 21st century, anesthesiologists and pain researchers noticed something intriguing. In some studies, people with natural red hair seem to require slightly higher doses of certain anesthetics or painkillers. Others reported subtle differences in pain thresholds or responses to specific kinds of stimuli like pressure or cold. The proposed link again ran through MC1R, which is active not only in pigment cells but also, in some forms, in parts of the nervous system. If a receptor involved in one chemical pathway is tweaked, the thinking went, perhaps it might echo in another. These findings have often been summarized in headlines as "redheads feel more pain" or "redheads are harder to numb," yet the data beneath those phrases are mixed. Some experiments do find detectable differences, others find none or find them only for particular drugs, in small groups, under tightly controlled conditions. The results can vary depending on who is being tested, what test is used, and which variants they actually carry. Pain itself is notoriously hard to measure. It weaves together biology, mood, expectation, culture, and context. So far, the cautious interpretation is that certain MC1R variants may, in some people, modestly shift how their nervous system processes particular signals or medications. It is not that all red-haired people are doomed to feel more pain, or that all doctors must dramatically change their practice. It is rather that there may be subtle, population-level tendencies that remind clinicians to treat each patient as an individual, not as a colour category. Biology here once again offers probabilities, not scripts. Around these quiet, technical questions, much louder social stories continue to ring. Red hair has long been associated in European and related cultures with particular temperaments: fiery, passionate, quick-tempered, untrustworthy, seductive, stubborn, charmingly mischievous. In earlier centuries, those stereotypes could be ominous. In modern entertainment and advertising, they are often played for humour or as a form of quirky branding. A character's hair colour can silently signal that they are impulsive, rebellious, or unpredictable before they speak a word. These associations persist not because they are rooted in solid evidence about personality, but because they are satisfying narratives that fold easily into older symbolic systems. Colour is memorable. Rare colour is especially memorable. If only a small fraction of people in a community have bright red hair, their deeds, good or bad, tend to stand out. Over time, memory can exaggerate the connection. A village might quietly forget dozens of calm, thoughtful, red-haired neighbours but retell for decades the story of one dramatic fight or scandal. A schoolyard might notice every time the one red-haired child loses their temper and overlook the many outbursts from children with more common looks. In this way, rarity and visibility amplify selective attention. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a kind of attentional bias. We are drawn to what is unusual. We are then tempted to build theories around what we notice, and to use those theories to filter future observations. Once the idea of a fiery redhead exists, each matching example feels like confirmation. Each non-matching example is easy to forget. Genes, at most, may influence broad tendencies: how our nervous systems respond to stimuli, how easily we blush, how our hormones fluctuate under stress. But those slight biological tilts are joined by environment, upbringing, culture, and individual choice in ways that define neat, colour-coded personalities. A child teased for their hair might become more reserved, or more combative, or more determined to excel, depending on countless surrounding factors. Another, celebrated for being distinctive, might lean into a dramatic role because it is rewarded. In each case, social perception and self-perception entangle, shaping behaviour over time. That entanglement is where many modern myths about red hair live, not in DNA but in the feedback loop between what people expect and how they react. For medical genetics, this raises an important caution. Finding that a certain variant is associated with slightly higher sun sensitivity or a faintly different average response to a drug does not mean that everyone with that variant is fragile, doomed, or fundamentally different. Association is not destiny. It is a statistical pattern drawn from large groups, smoothed over enormous individual variation. In healthcare, the responsible response is not to label or to fear, but to be aware, to recognise that someone with very fair skin and freckles may need more careful sun protection and regular skin checks, regardless of their ancestry story. To accept that a patient occasionally might respond to anaesthesia or pain medication in unexpected ways, and that part of good medicine is adjusting as needed, guided by both research and the patient's own report. In daily life, the responsible response is even simpler: to resist the urge to turn small, probabilistic differences into sweeping judgments about character or worth. Rarity will always draw the eye. Unusual traits, like bright red hair in a sea of browns and blacks, will always invite stories. The human mind likes clean explanations. This gene means that behaviour. This colour means that heart. But the closer scientists look at the links between genes, bodies, and environments, the more those explanations blur. Sunlight can be both friend and hazard. A receptor that shapes pigment can whisper into the nervous system. A visible, uncommon trait can change how a child is treated, which in turn can change the kind of adult they become. These are real, tangled trade-offs, lived out in countless individual lives. They are also reminders that the appeal of simple stories about purity, destiny, or temperament often rests on ignoring the quieter, more intricate interplay between genes and the worlds they move through. To follow the red hair gene honestly is to accept that it does matter, but never alone. It opens certain doors a crack, closes others halfway, and then hands the keys to chance, circumstance, and choice. If we step back now and look at the whole path we have walked, the red hair story begins to look less like a tale about a special group of people, and more like a case study in how humans turn biology into meaning. At the centre sits a modest molecule, melanin, and a slightly eccentric receptor, MC1R, along with a handful of other genes. On their own, they are ordinary pieces of cellular machinery. They pass signals, adjust pigment production, nudge cells toward one chemical pathway or another. A few changes in their code tilt the balance toward pheomelanin, and suddenly in the human eye that small biochemical decision becomes red hair. From there, everything else is interpretation. We have followed those interpretations backward in time, watching them branch and fold. One set of explanations comes from evolutionary biology. Perhaps, in northern latitudes with weak sun, lighter skin and hair helped bodies make vitamin D. Perhaps sexual selection magnified a rare, eye-catching trait. Perhaps population bottlenecks and founder effects let certain variants drift to high frequency in small, isolated groups. Each idea offers a plausible piece of the puzzle, yet none of them unlocks a single, hidden door. The distribution of red hair in Europe and beyond does not line up with one clean map. It does not rise and fall in perfect sync with sunlight, or with any single migration, or with a tidy story of Celts, Vikings, or any other named people. When geneticists peer into ancient genomes, they find MC1R variants appearing and disappearing in different places at different times, mingling with many ancestries, sometimes expressed, sometimes silent. When they run statistical models, they see signals of both selection and drift, and the faint fingerprints of chance events we can no longer reconstruct in detail. Instead of one master key, there is a ring of smaller keys: climate, diet, disease environment, marriage patterns, trade routes, wars, famines, local customs about beauty, and plain, unpredictable luck. Each key turns a little, and together they open a space where a trait like red hair can flourish for a while, or fade, or persist in pockets. Alongside these quiet, invisible forces runs another, louder current: storytelling. Long before anyone could measure vitamin D levels or sequence DNA, people noticed that a few among them had hair the colour of embers, fox fur, dried blood, or flame. In some eras and regions, that rarity was placed on a pedestal, the sign of a god, a king, or a lover whose brightness set them apart. In others, it was burdened with suspicion, an omen of treachery, witchcraft, foreignness, or uncontrolled passion. Those stories travelled as people moved. Phoenician merchants, Greek historians, Roman soldiers, Arab geographers, medieval monks, early modern painters, all carried and reshaped images of red-haired bodies. Later, scientists and race theorists added their own layers, dressing prejudice in the language of measurement and destiny. Modern media softened some of the sharper edges, but often kept the habit of treating red hair as a shorthand for temperament. None of this is encoded in MC1R. What the gene contributes is simply visibility and rarity. What humans add is imagination. We build patterns out of what we notice. We mistake correlation for character. We compress a spectrum of experiences into a type: the Celtic warrior, the treacherous Judas, the fiery heroine, the quirky sidekick. Over time, these narrative shortcuts feel as solid as mountains, even though they rest on sand. Distinguishing between what is well supported and what is symbolic requires a kind of double vision. On one side, genetic and archaeological evidence supports certain broad claims. It is well grounded to say that variants affecting melanin pathways arose multiple times in human history, that some of them seem more common in populations whose ancestors lived for millennia in higher latitudes, and that, on average, people with those variants may sunburn more easily, or respond somewhat differently to particular medications. It is also grounded to say that the presence of red hair in a person today does not reliably indicate that their ancestry is Celtic, Viking, or any other romantic label, and that ancient populations were far more mixed, mobile, and variable than 19th century race theories imagined. On the other side, many of the stories people tell about red hair belong more to the realm of culture than to the realm of testable fact. Claims that redheads are inherently more passionate, more deceitful, more mystical, more fertile, more doomed or more chosen are, at best, projections of older symbolic systems onto a convenient canvas. They tell us a great deal about the societies that invent them, and very little about the inner lives of individuals with red hair. Even some evolutionary explanations sit gently in the speculative category. The idea that red hair spread chiefly because it was sexually attractive in gloomy climates, or because it perfectly balanced vitamin D production and cancer risk, may be partly true, but our evidence is indirect and coarse. We can outline plausible pressures and observe present-day patterns. We cannot peer into the precise desires and fates of people who walked the late Pleistocene tundra. If we accept these limits, the red hair gene stops looking like a mysterious script that secretly writes destinies and starts looking like one tile among many in a vast mosaic. Migration scatters those tiles. Selection shifts their frequency up or down. Chance knocks a few out of the pattern or clusters them unexpectedly. Storytelling paints over the surface, tracing shapes and borders that feel ancient and inevitable, but that could easily have been drawn another way. The result is the world we see, a patchwork of shades and myths, of freckles and folk tales, of laboratory graphs and whispered superstitions. The past, in this view, is not a courtroom delivering verdicts about purity or belonging. It is more like a long, slow swirl of colour, in which any given hue, red, brown, black, blonde, has wandered, mixed, brightened, and dimmed countless times. To lie here, imagining that swirl, can be oddly calming. Every trait on your body, from your hair to your skin to the shape of your hands, carries a similar layered history, a touch of selection, a wash of drift, a line of descent that hopped from valley to valley, coast to island to city street. Around each trait, people before you spun stories, of fortune and misfortune, beauty and danger, difference and sameness. Some of those stories help them navigate their worlds, some of them hurt. The mysterious gene we have been following reminds us that none of these tales is the final word. Biology sketches possibilities. Culture colours them in. Individual lives trace their own lines across both. As you let the details recede, the receptor names the maps and timelines, the echoes of old prejudices, what remains is a softer insight. We are all, in our different ways, unlikely outcomes. The particular combination of genes you carry, the particular web of stories you were born into, has never appeared before and will never appear again. No single strand can explain you. No colour can confine you. In that sense, the red hair story is not an exception, but a mirror. It shows how eagerly we reach for simple explanations, and how gently the evidence asks us to accept complexity instead. In a moment, we will leave the laboratories and legends behind, and return to the quiet of the present, where the past can be a companion, not a judge, and where every shade of hair and skin can simply rest, for a while, in the dark. As the past settles back into its own time, the central question we began with feels a little different. We set out wondering whether red hair carried some hidden truth about ancestry, destiny, or character, whether the legends we inherit might be pointing to a secret, scientific core. Following the trail through genes, skeletons, manuscripts, and half-remembered fears, the answer that emerges is softer and more complicated than any single myth. The evidence is clear enough on a few points. There is no single redhead people, no unbroken line of fiery-haired ancestors marching from the Ice Age into one modern nation. There is no honest way to read loyalty, temper, or purity from a strand of hair. The patterns we can see, frequencies, variants, pale maps of migration, tell us about populations, not about souls. Beyond that, the ground becomes more tentative. We can say that certain genetic variants likely helped some bodies cope with dim northern light. We can say that rarity and contrast may have made those variants more visible in the small human marketplaces of attraction and family. But we cannot weigh, in any precise way, how much each force mattered. We are looking at footprints after the tide has washed them, tracing shapes in the sand and knowing they might have been drawn slightly differently by chance alone. The myths, when we lay them alongside this evidence, become something else. Not secret codes waiting to be decoded, but historical weather, gusts of fear and fashion, reverence and ridicule, moving over the same small set of biological possibilities. Some stories contradict what we now know. They claim too much, too loudly. Others align by accident, a folk belief about fragility or sunshyness that happens to echo a modern dermatology study. Many more hover in between, half metaphor, half observation, more revealing of the storytellers than of the people being described, sitting with both sides at once, what can be measured and what cannot, does not give us a dramatic unmasking. It gives us something quieter, a habit of gentler doubt, a willingness to ask, each time we meet a tale about what these people are like, whether we are hearing an echo of old circumstances, an expression of old power, or simply a human love of pattern-making that has run a little too far. That habit extends beyond red hair. It touches every label, every stereotype, every confident sentence that begins with, "People like that always." The mysterious gene, in the end, is not asking us to marvel at its power. It is asking us to notice how eagerly we wrap it, and traits like it, in meanings it never chose. If that awareness lingers with you as you drift towards sleep, the story has done its work. Before you let go completely, if you've enjoyed wandering through this long winding history with me, you can help this channel in a very simple way. Gently tap like if you haven't already. If you'd like to hear more slow journeys through the past, you can subscribe, so the next story finds its way to you when you're ready for it. I would also love to know where you are in the world right now and what time it is as you listen. Are you in a bright afternoon, pausing between tasks? A blue evening, waiting for the first stars? A deep night, half asleep, somewhere far from where this was recorded? If you feel like sharing, leave a comment with your country or city and the hour on your clock. Over time, those small notes gather into their own quiet map, a reminder that people are lying awake or dozing off in so many different places at once. As you listen to the last of this story, you might picture that map, dots of light scattered across continents and islands, along coasts and rivers, up in mountain towns and down in crowded cities. In some of those rooms, someone with red hair is turning onto their side. In others, someone with none at all. In most, people carrying mixtures of genes and histories their ancestors could never have imagined. The ancient glaciers, the Bronze Age traders, the monks and sailors and farmers whose choices and chances mingled your ancestry. They are all now very far away. Their worries are finished. Their loves and fears have folded into the past. What reaches you from them are traces. A molecule here, a folk tale there, a name, a custom, a shade of hair that catches in the morning light. You do not have to solve their mysteries tonight. You do not have to locate yourself precisely on any genetic map or carry any legend alone. You can simply let the knowledge that things are more tangled and more shared than most stories admit make the world feel a little softer at the edges. If the questions we touched on have nudged your curiosity awake, you can always come back on another evening to explore a different corner of history. There are countless other traits, other myths, other journeys from molecule to meaning waiting just beyond the edge of sleep. For now, wherever you are, and whatever colour your hair once was, or is, or might someday be in memory, may your night be easy, your breathing slow, and your dreams wide enough to hold all the complexities that daylight tends to flatten. Rest well, from here, to wherever you are in the world, and when you wake, the past will still be there, quiet and patient, ready to share another story when you're ready to listen.